Welcome to Ray's Reflection, the Common Man's Bible Study. Today we're going to continue in the Passion of Christ, and I'm sure we'll be in there for another week at least besides this. We're in John chapter 19, and we're going to be beginning with verse 7 of John 19. We have, we'll probably go back to verse 6 to just to catch us up on where Christ is in this process. Before we start, I want to remind you again for the, I don't know how many times I've repeated it, but this is all orchestrated. This was orchestrated before this event happened. It is written in the Old Testament. And some of this stuff is going to come through. And I will show you where. And the other thing you have to keep in mind, and I'll repeat that, is John is writing this to show that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. So therefore, some of the things, some of the events, the chronological order isn't here. There are things missing. And you will see that, and it's designed for that purpose. So let's start with verse 7. Let's see where we are. Verse 6, it says, "When the chief priests, therefore, and the officers saw him, they cried on him, 'Crucify him, crucify him.'" In other words, here's where we're at. Pilate brings Christ out and he says, "Behold the man," and they want him crucified. And Pilate said unto them, "Take ye him and crucify him." In other words, Pilate is giving them authority to crucify Christ. He's given them the authority. Now they don't have it. I think through this process you have to understand the desire of the Roman people, Pilate, and the weakness of Pilate. His strength is in the law. If you watched a parade of Roman soldiers marching in, they will always be carrying this bundle of, it looks like a bundle of sticks with an axe on it that represents the law. They're very, very concerned about upholding the law. And this is what Pilate is doing. Pilate is looking for something in Jesus Christ that broke the law, or the Roman law, and he finds nothing. And therefore that's why he continues to say, "I find no fault in him." And they say, "Crucify him, crucify him," and obviously he's not going to do that because he's going to be breaking his own law. Can you imagine him going back to Rome and explaining to Rome how he crucified a man who had not broken any laws? And therefore that would not set well. So he's kind of caught in a bind. But they yell out to him, "Crucify him, crucify him." And verse 7 says this, "The Jews answered him and says, We have a law." In other words, this is a Jewish law, it's not a Roman law. "And by our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." In other words, he literally blasphemed. When Pilate heard therefore this saying, he was more afraid. Now we have to understand in this that Pilate's background tells us that he believed in different gods. And with the miracles that were done, and with him calling himself the Son of God, in Pilate's mind he could very well have been one of the gods that was known to visit mankind. So therefore he's afraid. And he went again into the judgment hall and said to Jesus, "From where art thou?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Then said Pilate unto him, "Speak thou not unto me?" In other words, aren't you going to speak to me? "Don't you know? Knowest not thou not that I have the power to crucify thee and have the power to release thee?" In other words, I have the power. I have the power. I have the authority. Now Jesus answers and sets him straight. "Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except if it be given thee from above." In other words, you have no power except that which has been given to you. He said, "Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin." Who delivered him unto Pilate? These Pharisees. These Pharisees, these religious group, has turned him over to Pilate, and therefore they have the greater sin. Now we have to stop there. Are we saying here, is he saying here that there is different degrees of sin? The answer is yes. What does Pilate know of Scripture? He knows nothing. What do they know of Scripture? They've had Scripture all their lives. Therefore, they had the light. They've had the truth. And they refuse to listen to it. They refuse to adhere to it. And therefore, they have the greater sin. And make no mistake about it. People sitting in our pews and do not accept Jesus Christ, but hear over and over and over again the gospel, have a greater sin. Their sin is far greater than a man running the back ridges of Borneo who has never heard the gospel. Who has the greater sin? And therefore, there are greater sins. And in other portions of Scripture, there is an indication where hell is made up of varying stripes. In other words, varying degrees of punishment. So therefore, he's saying here, the greater sin lies with those who turn me over to you because you did not have the Scriptures. You did not have the light. You didn't have the background. So this is what he's saying to Pilate. He says, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. See, Pilate is trying to release him. But the Jews cried out, if thou let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. Whosoever make himself a king speaketh against Caesar. Now we got a political motivation. Now Pilate is going to be afraid politically. And can you imagine if he lets Jesus Christ go, these people are going to report to Caesar that he let a person who is a rebellion, who is committing treason, let him go. And therefore he would have a political battle. So now he has a personal religious battle that he's afraid of, that maybe this is God. And now he has a political battle. In other words, he will lose his position if he does this. So he's caught between a rock and a hard place. So what does he do? Well, so when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus forth and sat him down, and sat down in a judgment seat in a place that is called the pavement, but in the Hebrew it is called Abatha. If you look at the picture I have on the PowerPoint here, you will see the floor is down here, and then there's a wall, and then the seat is raised above. Now, this is called in the Greek, not in the Hebrew, but in the Greek, this is called the bema. Now, those of you who are familiar with prophecy, and you understand what the bema is, the bema is a Greek term where judgment was made and criminals were determined to be guilty or not guilty. And it was also a place where athletes were rewarded for participating in the games if they won or they lost. It was dealt with at the bema. And therefore, when we look at it prophetically, the judgment seat of Christ is called the bema. So therefore, this is a place where reward is, and in this particular case, it was where judgment is passed. It's like the trial is over and it's time to pass sentence on the individual. Either pronounce him guilty and put a sentence on him or let him go. So Jesus Christ brings him here. And so in the Greek, this is basically what the bema would be like. And it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. For us, and the way John is writing here for us, this would be about 9 o'clock. So you can see a lot of meetings have been going on, a lot of confrontations, a lot of trials, a lot of testing of Christ has been going on, and now it's 9 o'clock in the morning. And he said unto the Jews, behold your king. Now this is Pilate being very uncomfortable with the position they put him in, and now he's being sarcastic. But they said, but they cried out, away with him. Crucify him. And Pilate said unto them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priest answered and said, we have no king but Caesar. See what he's doing? The chief priests are putting themselves under the Roman law, etc., and putting Pilate in a position where, hey, you don't crucify this man. Said, we're going to go to our king with this matter. So then Pilate delivered him, therefore, unto them to be crucified. And they took Jesus and led him away. Now, you need to understand that statement, led him away. They didn't grab him and drag him. They led him, very much like a sheep would be led to slaughter. When we look at trials and sentences of crucifixion passed upon people, the person on whom it was passed on would scream and holler and resist and fight and try to get away, and they would do whatever they could to prolong to put this off. And here you don't see any of that. What you do see is you see him being led off. And it says this, and of course it doesn't go through all the things of the crucifixion, but it says this, and he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of the skulls, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha. Now, I'm going to show you two pictures. This is the place of the skulls. Now, you can see why it's the place of the skulls, because it looks like a human face in that cliff. You see it? And if you went there today, and this picture is probably from today, this is what you would see. Now, I'm going to show you another picture. Here it is at a distance. Can you see it? Now, you see this right in front of that. You see right here. Right here. This is a road that comes down in front of this. Now, tradition tells us that he was crucified up here. And that is not correct. He was crucified along this road, and as you go by here just a few 50 feet or so, now you have a wall of the city right here. So he was crucified on this road here, right on the side of the road, right down here. Now you'll see this fence here. See this fence here? This fence here is the fence across the road surrounding the garden where the tomb was. And I will show you where that tomb was eventually. But you're looking from the tomb, you're looking at this here, and this is what you see, the place of the skull. Here are the eyes, here's the nose, and so on. And he was crucified here. And he was probably, and pictures, tradition shows him being hung up on a cross, etc. But he was probably, his feet were probably a foot or 2 feet, probably a foot or 2 feet from the ground. His feet were, they weren't very far from the ground. And therefore, he was kind of scrunched, his knees were kind of bent. And you could almost, it was almost eye level with the people. His head was just slightly higher than the average person, etc. So they could walk by him and throw insults into his face. And contrary to what tradition has, he literally was naked. There wasn't a cloth around him. He was naked. They were stripped him naked. That's part of the embarrassment. And this is where he was crucified. He said, this is where they crucified him, and there were 2 others with him on either side, one and Jesus in the center. Now you will not see here the conversation he had with those 2 thieves. Jesus was in the center, so there were 3 people crucified, and obviously if you go back to Luke or you go back to Gospel of Matthew, etc., they will tell you the incidents and the conversation that went on. But John does not report that here. Okay, and here you have the crucifixion. I have a picture of the crucifixion, and you will see that this is on top of a hill, the picture. And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. And the writing was, this is what it was. It was Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, if you look in verse 20, it tells you that this title then read many of the Jews, for the place where the Jews was crucified was near to the city. And that's why I say about 50 feet further down you will see the first wall of the city. And it was written in Hebrew, it was written in Greek, see that would be the second line, and it was written in Latin. That would be the third line. So therefore, there wasn't too many people, very, very few people would not understand what this said. And now let's go back and see what it says. He says, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, the Jewish Sanhedrin is going to be really upset with that, because they can see the mockery that Pilate is letting them, is making of them. Said, then said the chief priests of the Jews to Pilate, write not the King of the Jews. Don't write that. Instead, write, he said, I am the King of the Jews. In other words, write that this is a claim by Jesus. It's not the fact that this is what he is. And Pilate is just about fed up with them, because they forced him, in his mind, to crucify an innocent man. Then the soldiers, when they had, and whether Pilate answered, he said, what I have written, I have written. And without knowing, without realizing what he was doing, here was a man who was fulfilling Scripture. Here was a man who did not know Scripture. Here was a man who was committing a sin by killing an innocent man. He was breaking his own laws. And here was a man who was doing, he was crucifying an innocent man because of expediency. Because it was expedient for him, because the Jews would turn him into Rome, and he was looking out for his own interest. So by this point, he is fed up. He said, I've written what I've written, and that's the end of it. And he's fulfilling Scripture. And then it says this, then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts. So that tells us instantly that there were 4 soldiers in this crucifixion. This crucifixion team was made up of 4 soldiers. And every soldier a part, and also his coat. Now the coat was without seam, woven from the top throughout. Now, the coat was without seam. Now, if we go through this, I'll read the next verse, but there is something here very subtle of John, what John is doing. Then said, therefore among themselves, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the Scriptures might be fulfilled, which saith, they parted my raiment among them, and for my vesture they did cast lots. These things therefore the soldiers did. Now the soldiers don't know anything about Scripture, but the Scripture had been, God had orchestrated this, written this beforehand, that this is what the soldiers would do. This is what the executioners would do, and here they're doing it. Now what are they casting their lots for? They're casting lots for a coat that is seamless. Now if you go back and you study the clothing of the people of the time, all of their clothing were seamed. But there was one person who had a seam, a cloak that was unseamed, and that was the high priest. It was specially designed, etc. Now, where Christ got this coat, we don't know. Scripture doesn't tell us where he got it, but he tells us he has it. And John tells us that this is going on because Scripture is being fulfilled. He's showing you that Scripture is being fulfilled. But he's also shown you in a subtle way that if the unseamed coat belonged to a high priest, then here is God's high priest. Here is God's high priest. The true high priest is now offering the sacrifice of himself. And without letting people know this, John is writing it in a way that people who understand Jewish culture would understand this instantly. This is a high priest. Would the soldiers know this? The answer is no. But those who had been listening to Jesus' claims that he was the Son of God would begin to see this picture clearly. Then it says this, now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister, that's 2, Mary, the wife of Clopas, that's 3, and Mary Magdalene, that's 4. And when Jesus, there they are casting lots. I have a picture of it. It says this, when therefore Jesus saw his mother and the disciples standing by him whom he loved, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold thy son." Now, listen carefully. Here is Jesus Christ on the cross, and he calls his mother woman. Now, in today's society, if you called your mother woman, it's like a derogatory thing. It's like a derogatory thing. Instead, what this is an affection. And what he's doing is he's saying, "Behold thy son." He's not looking at himself and saying, "Behold thy son." In other words, behold me hanging on a cross. That's not what he's talking about. He's making sure that Mary is taken care of. And he's looking at the apostle that is there, and that is John, the apostle John. He's looking at John, at Mary, and he's saying, "Behold your son. From now on, he is your son." In Jewish society, the son would take care of the mother, and therefore he's turning her over to John. And then if you go a little bit further, it says this, "Then said the disciple," he said, then he said to the disciple, he said, "Behold thy mother." And he's returning, he's telling John, it's your responsibility now to take care of Mary. Now, this is not calling her woman, doesn't degrade her, etc. Do you remember the first time he called her woman? The first time he called her woman is when he started his ministry and he made his first miracle. Remember changing the water into wine? And she basically told him to listen to and do whatever his son said, and he looked at her and he says, "Woman, what have thou to do with me? You have nothing to do with me." It's like saying, you're a human and I'm God, and there's nothing you can do and involve yourself in the salvation of mankind, in the work that's required to save mankind. And he's making that understood. And the Catholic Church does not do this. The Catholic Church makes her just like God, and makes her a mediatrix, and assumes she was born without sin, and she was assumed into heaven. All of this is not here. All of this is looking at this woman who was his earthly mother, and he's saying, look, John will take care of you from now on, and John, you take care of her. So even from the cross, you can see that this is orchestrated. And then the last thing I'm going to talk to you about today is this here. It says, "After this, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, I thirst." Notice he didn't have to say he was thirsty. He said it to fulfill scripture, because the scripture tells us that they would give him something to drink. It says, "Now there was set a vessel full of vinegar," or, in probably understand it would be sour wine. "And they filled a sponge with vinegar and put it upon a hyssop and put it in his mouth." Now, so in order to fulfill scripture, and in order to have this happen, he says, "I thirst." And this would cause them to do this sort of thing. Now we look at it and we say, wow, in all this horrific, tremendous brutality, there's a little spot of mercy. And that's not true. That's not true at all. The reason they were quick to give him this liquid, this vinegar, because they had offered him gall before to numb the pain, and he refused it, is this. A person who was being crucified, one of the things they would die of is dehydration. And the people who were crucifying him, and remember, the crucifixion was designed to torture an individual, bring him a lot of pain. So in order to do that, they would give them this liquid, this sour wine, this vinegar, and that would prolong their suffering, because it would delay dehydration. And so therefore, this act of giving him this vinegar, etc., was not an act of mercy. It was a sadistic act. It was a sadistic act to prolong his suffering. And the moment he took that, right after he took that drink, which would prolong his suffering, he immediately gives up the ghost, telling everybody that he's the one in control, not them. He will die when he will die. And you must remember, as we go back into scriptures, you remember it says he's the one who lays down his life. No one takes it from him. And therefore they're not going to prolong his life and prolong the suffering. They can give him all the water they want. When it's time for him to die, he will die. So next week, I will deal with the last statement he makes from the cross, which is, "It is finished." And I will deal with the aspect of what was accomplished by his dying. And as cruel and as bitter, and sometimes when we watch this, we want to turn our face away. It was done for you and me. It was done so that you and I could have a free pass into heaven. And it was done so that you and I would not have to pay for that sin. So our sins has all been paid for. And it is a tremendous affront to Jesus Christ and to what is going on here to think that mankind can pay or have any kind of penitence for his own sin. That is an insult to what God has done. It's literally saying, I can help in my salvation. I can help pay the price. Christ, you haven't done enough. And therefore, anyone who turns and thinks they can work their way into heaven, or they can punish themselves, whip themselves, beat themselves, walk on broken glass, whatever, to share in some of the suffering of Christ, are making an insult to what is going on here. So I will leave you with that thought, and we will start with this and finish chapter 19 next time. So until next time, I wish you Godspeed from On Victory's Side. We'll see you next week.